After alluding to the organization of the Crusades by Peter the Hermit and to the outpouring from Europe into Palestine of tens of thousands of saints, devotees, and enthusiasts to waste their blood and treasure in a barren and unprofitable adventure, he proceeds to say that it was deemed necessary that those who took up the sign of the cross in this enterprise should form themselves into such societies as might secure them from spies and treacheries, and that each might know his companion and fellow laborer by dark as well as by day, as it was with Jephthah's army at the passes of the Jordan, so also was it requisite in these expeditions that certain signs, signals, watchwords, or passwords should be known amongst them, for the armies consisted of various nations and various languages. No project or device, he thinks, could answer the purpose of the Crusaders better than those of Masonry. The maxims and ceremonials attending the Master's order had been previously established and were materially necessary on that expedition, for as the Mohammedans were also worshippers of the deity, and as the enterprisers were seeking a country where the Masons were in the time of Solomon called into an association, and where some remains would certainly be found of the mysteries and wisdom of the ancients and of our predecessors, such degrees of Masonry as extended only to their being servants of the God of nature would not have distinguished them from those they had to encounter, had they not assumed the symbols of the Christian faith. The hypothesis of Hutchinson is, then, that while there was some Masonry in Palestine before the advent of the Crusaders, it was only that earlier stage which he had already described as appertaining to the apprentice's degree, and which was what both he and Oliver have called patriarchal Masonry. The higher stage represented by the master's degree was of course unknown to the Saracens, as it was of Christian origin, and the possession of this degree only could form any distinctive mark between the Crusaders and their Moslem foes. This degree, therefore, he thinks, was introduced into Palestine as a war measure to supply the Christians with signs and words which would be to them a means of protection. The full force of the language bears only this interpretation that Freemasonry was used by the Crusaders not for purposes of peace, but for those of war, a sentiment so abhorrent to the true spirit of the institution that nothing but a blind adhesion to a preconceived theory could have led so good a Mason as Hutchinson to adopt or to advance such an opinion. Differing still more from Ramsay, who had attributed the origin of Masonry to the knights and nobles of the Crusades, Hutchinson assigns the task of introducing it into Palestine to the religious and not to the military element of these expeditions. All the learning of Europe in those times, he continues, was possessed by the religious. They had acquired the wisdom of the ancients and the original knowledge, which was in the beginning and now is the truth. Many of them had been initiated into the mysteries of Masonry. They were the projectors of the Crusades, and as Solomon, in the building of the temple, introduced orders and regulations for the conduct of the work, which his wisdom had been enriched with from the sages of antiquity, so that no confusion should happen during its progress, and so that the rank and office of each fellow laborer might be distinguished and ascertained beyond the possibility of doubt. In like manner, the priests projecting the Crusades, being possessed of the mysteries of Masonry, the knowledge of the ancients, and of the universal language which survived the confusion of Shinar, revived the orders and regulations of Solomon, and initiated the legions therein who followed them to the Holy Land. Hence that secrecy which attended the Crusades. Mr. Hutchinson concludes this collection of assumptions, cumulated one upon another, without the slightest attempt to verify historically a single statement, by asserting that, among other evidences which authorize us in the conjecture that Masons went to the Holy Wars, is the doctrine of that order of Masons called the higher order, that is to say, the higher degrees, which he says that he was induced to believe was of Scottish origin. He obtained this idea probably from the theory of Ramsay, but be that as it may, he thinks it conclusively proved that the Masons were Crusaders, a conclusion that it would be difficult to infer from any known rules of logic. The fact, if it be admitted, that these higher degrees were invented in Scotland by no means proves that the Masons who possessed them went to the Crusades. It is impossible, indeed, to find any natural connection or sequence between the two circumstances. But the legend, which refers to the establishment in Scotland of a system of Masonry at the time of the suppression of the order and the martyrdom of De Molay, belongs to another portion of the legendary history of Freemasonry and will be treated in a distinct chapter. Von Hammer shows to what shifts for arguments those are reduced who pretend that the institution of Freemasonry was derived at the Crusades by the Knights Templars from the secret societies of the East. He says, as a proof of the truth of this hypothesis, which indeed he makes as a charge against the Templars, that their secret maxims, particularly in so far as relates to the renunciation of positive religion and the extension of their power by the acquisition of castles and strong places, seem to have been the same as those of the order of assassins. The similarity also of the white dress and red fillet of the assassins with the white mantle and red cross of the Templars, he thinks, is certainly remarkable. Hence he assumes that as the assassins were a branch of the Ishmaelite, whom he calls the Illuminati of the East, and as the former were a secret society of revolutionary principles, which is a characteristic that he gratuitously bestows upon the Freemasons, he takes it for granted that the assassins supplied the Templars with those ideas of organization and doctrine out of which they created the system of Freemasonry that they afterward introduced into Europe. A series of arguments like this is scarcely worthy of a serious refutation. The statement that the Templars ever renounced the precepts of positive religion, either at that early period of their career or at any subsequent time, is a mere assumption, based on the charges made by the malevolence of a wicked king and a still more wicked pope. The construction of fortresses and castles for their protection by both the Templars and the Assassins arose from the military instinct, which teaches all armies to provide the means of defense when in the presence of an enemy. And lastly, the argument drawn from the similarity of the costumes of both orders is so puerile as to require no other answer than that, as the mantle and cross of the Templars were bestowed upon them, the former by Pope Honorius and the latter by Pope Eugenius. Therefore, they could not have been indebted to the Assassins for either. The best refutation of the slanders of von Hammer is the fact that to sustain his views he was obliged to depend on such poverty of argument. Recognizing as historically true the fact that the Templars, or rather perhaps the architects and builders who accompanied them and were engaged in the construction of their fortresses and castles in the Holy Land, the remains of some of which still exist, brought with them to Europe some new views of Saracenic architecture, which they communicated to the guilds of Freemasons already established in Europe. We may dismiss the further consideration of that subject as having nothing to do with the question of how much Freemasonry, as a secret society, was indebted for its origin to Templarism.